Welcome to episode 7. I can't believe we're already at 7 out of a 9-part series. But hey, coming up today, you are going to hear a fabulous interview. This is from Peter Sukahira. Also, you're going to hear the very end of your last interview with Greg Koukl. And don't forget, we have Hermana. But right now, tell us, what was it like talking to Peter?
You know, I wasn't sure exactly what to expect when we were climbing Mount Carmel to get to interview Peter Sukahira. He's a Japanese American that was called many years ago to move to Israel with his wife, and the work that he's doing there is extraordinary. So this interview is heavy on the inspiration side, but there are some things about this interview that really connected me personally with some of his past experiences prior to his walking in faith. So you're going to find aspects of Peter's story that I think you'll bond to, or they'll remind you of somebody that you know. And when you see what it's emerged or what's evolved to, it's very inspirational. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this particular interview with you. Peter, thank you so much for taking some time today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, Patrick, I'm a Japanese American Israeli. I have a Japanese-looking face, an American-sounding voice, and an Israeli passport.
Wow.
And my wife and I came here as immigrants 30 years ago. In fact, 30 years ago this year.
Wow.
And we're both American-born. She's from a Jewish-American family. I'm from a Japanese-American family. We came to the Lord out of the hippie counterculture of the 1960s and the 1970s. We met in Boston, university there. But as soon as God got a hold of us, he began to speak to us about his plans for our life. And he told us we should get married and we would go into ministry and that we'd end up in Israel.
Huh.
And back then, neither of us had ever been here. We didn't know that much more about Israel than what we'd read, but we knew 40 years ago that we would end up here.
Wow.
And so we prepared for the ministry in the U.S., ministered there and in Japan for a while. But in 1987, God opened the doors for us to come to this land. And it was an experience like we had never experienced before, and nothing that we could have really even adequately prepared for. You know, to come as immigrants, it's the big reset button. You really start your life all over again. And we went through the culture shock and the language shock, but we knew that we would land here in this city, the city of Haifa, and that we would be planted on this mountain, which is Mount Carmel. And of course, it's biblically, it's the mountain of Elijah the prophet, and where he confronted the false prophets of Baal, rebuilt the altar of the Lord, prayed the prayer of faith, and God answered with fire that changed the nation of Israel back in the days of Elijah, changed the whole nation for more than a generation. So we have felt for a long time that that was our mandate, to once again bring the sacrifice that pleases God, rebuild his altar, pray the prayer of faith, and that God would answer by the fire of his presence to turn the hearts of the people of modern Israel, Jews and Arabs, back to the living God.
Well, you've landed at a beautiful spot here. We're outside on top of Mount Carmel. As a matter of fact, you said just over my shoulder over here is the very top of Mount Carmel, right? It's the highest point of Mount Carmel. And there's a lot of significance, as you alluded to, biblically in this area. So did you seek this out when you first came here, or how did you end up here?
Yes, we knew that this was the place that God had selected for us. And but when we got here, it was really an experience of discovery. Well, first of all, Mount Carmel is not a mountain in the traditional sense. It's really a ridge, and about 20-some miles long. The western edge sticks out into the Mediterranean, and the southeastern end overlooks the Valley of Armageddon. So it's a ridge maybe 500-some meters above sea level at its highest point, and this is the highest point. Yeah. We're right in the middle of it, right here, where our worship center and our ministry center are located. Behind me is our worship center, the worship center of the Carmel congregation, built here on Mount Carmel, and it's the first building built in modern times by an indigenous Israeli Messianic congregation for the purpose of worshiping Jesus in his own land, among his own people, in his own language. This is the first building built for that purpose in modern times.
So what was it like coming to this country and bringing a Christian message here? And what has evolved over time? Have you seen any changes since you've been here?
Well, first of all, when we arrived here, it was a lot different than it is today. I would say 30 years ago, there were less than 200 believers in our entire city.
Wow.
This is the third largest city of Israel, about 200,000 or 300,000 people. Less than 200 believers. That meant that within a year, we basically knew the names of just about everybody. And there were two small fellowships that were already in operation. Now, we wouldn't call them Christians because they were mostly Jews. And so we called them Messianic Jews. They prefer to maintain their identity as Jewish people, although they fully believe that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the King of Kings, and the Lord of Lords. They're disciples of Jesus, but they identify with the original apostles before Christianity even became a movement.
Right.
And so that was, first of all, that was a discovery that we had to make, that believers here call themselves Messianic believers. They call their communities congregations and not churches. And there's a new expression of faith in Jesus, biblical faith in Jesus, but it's arising from the people of Israel, the same people that Jesus knew, but many years ago. So he's being worshipped in his own land, in his own language, by his own people for the first time in 2,000 years.
Wow.
And so even though the numbers were small, we realized from day one this was remarkable. This wasn't something that could have been taught us in Bible school. It wasn't something that they could have, that they had textbooks about in seminary.
Right.
We had to come and actually meet these people ourselves and learn how they were solving problems, what it meant for Israeli Jews and Christian Arabs alongside of them, in many cases, to worship Jesus in his own land and in his own language for the first time again. So it was a great discovery process.
Wow, and this is what I'm curious about, if you can remember when you first got here, because it's been some decades now.
Yeah.
But Israel and the land of the Bible, if you will, lived abstractly in your mind when you were training, right?
Right.
What was the difference between understanding it from your classroom training and reading versus putting your feet on the ground here and being here? Was there a different experience relative to that for you?
That's a really good question, Patrick. It was like really coming to ground. And it was a process of having those abstractions stripped away.
Yeah.
And realizing when it says Nazareth, it means Nazareth. When it says Mount Carmel, you don't have to translate that into, this Carmel, that Carmel, our city, this continent, our nation. Okay, it meant here.
Right.
So it was that process of really entering a more substantial biblical reality, and also realizing that there were tremendous challenges and spiritual enemies that had to be overcome in order to bring the faith that was originally released by these people to the world, to bring it back to them 2,000 years later.
Right.
And so it really was a period of spiritual and cultural shock that we went through as new immigrants 30 years ago.
What was the most shocking thing?
Well, first of all, it was the language.
Yes.
I studied Japanese, I spoke English, and now Hebrew. It has no relationship to either of those languages. It was completely starting afresh. And then to learn that it's a reborn language. People didn't speak it as an everyday language for over 1,000 years.
Right.
And it was basically recreated for the purpose of use in the modern nation. And to struggle with learning a new language. And then after we'd been here 2 or 3 years, of course, we had our first war experience. And in 1991, the first Gulf War took place. And if you remember, Saddam Hussein, who was ruling Iraq at the time, had taken over Kuwait. And the first President Bush had given him a countdown, a deadline. You get out of Kuwait by this date or there's going to be war. And so the whole world was counting down. Yeah. And what Saddam Hussein said in the Arabic press, which is, of course, immediately translated into the Israeli press, was that if any Western power attacks me, I will immediately attack Israel. I mean, that
Yeah.
it may not sound logical, but in this
Right.
part of the world, that's how it works. Okay, I'll
Right.
immediately attack Israel. And he was boasting that he would burn half of Israel with weapons of mass destruction. So in the countdown to the war, we were following our government's instructions to get gas masks. We had 2 small children at the time. We had to seal a room in our apartment, and they gave instructions how to put tape and on the windows and seal the doors. Our son was too small to have a gas mask issued to him, so what they issued him was a small plastic pup tent that you had to thrust the little baby inside, zip it up, and then you could kind of feed him a bottle with the gloves, that they had.
Oh, wow.
And the fear was that Saddam Hussein would carry out his promise and attack Israel with nerve gas.
It's a very strange characterization to hear the words, our first war.
Yeah.
And I can remember watching the news back in the States, with the first Gulf War and the countdown and everything. But boy, being here and coming from, a place like the United States to this hotbed, right? Which biblically over time, I mean, it's just always been that way, right? And here you are, having to, get tents for your little child and have a whole preparation done, and it became a new way of life. So I guess that's culture shock, huh?
Well, everybody who becomes a citizen of Israel has to have a first war, it seems.
Yeah.
And this was ours. And as new immigrants we were just barely being able to understand the television and the radio, when to go in the room, when to come out of the room, when to put on the gas mask or not. It was a dislocating and frightening experience. But we also saw the hand of God miraculously protect the nation.
Yeah.
I think what was said after that, 39 big Scud missiles fell in this country, 9 of them in our city of Haifa. And these were not the little rockets that are shot by Hamas in the south or Hezbollah from Lebanon. Those rockets, they fire by the dozens from the back of trucks.
Right.
And they're dangerous because they're anti-personnel terror weapons. They're loaded with ball bearings, and if you're in the open, they can seriously wound you or even kill you. But these Scud missiles they had like 500 pounds of explosives in them. They would take out entire buildings. But I think it was about 100 days of war, only one person was actually killed as a direct result of those missiles, which is a miracle.
Yeah.
In fact, there are some people who say that during that first Gulf War, the death rate in Israel actually went down. Fewer people than normal actually died, and if that's true, it's because Israelis didn't drive as much.
Interesting.
They only launched the missiles at night, and so you knew when it was like 4 or 5 in the afternoon here, it was already 6 or 7 in Iraq, and so people stayed off the roads.
Right. What's very interesting is many of the people I've met here since we've been in Israel have this sense of God's protection.
Yeah.
For the state of Israel.
Yeah.
And they don't have it just abstractly, but they like to cite specific instances where things that would defy normal logic occur that seem to just protect this place.
Absolutely. Not only have we heard those stories, but we've experienced it ourselves. And when we came through that war experience, I think something changed in us.
Yeah.
After the first Gulf War, we felt like we'd somehow turned some kind of spiritual corner, and that our roots, after 3 years, were finally beginning to go down into the rocky soil of this land, and that we began to feel like we were Israelis.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that just in the months after the end of the first Gulf War, in the spring of 1991, God put us together with another couple. They were pioneering a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center in another part of Haifa. A small Bible study had started there. We came alongside of them and began to pray together, and God spoke to us that spring, start a new congregation. And that's how this ministry was born, 26 years ago in 1991.
Wow. So leading up to all the anxiety before your first war, as you described it, did that have any impact on your faith? Or were you starting to question whether you really did the right thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell me what that was like.
Being an immigrant was one of the hardest things I ever did. Nothing can prepare you for that. You really start your life again. And in our case, we didn't really have family here. We didn't have friends. We didn't have connections. We didn't know the language. We didn't understand the culture. We didn't know how to get things done in the society, in our neighborhood. Within a year or two, our children were speaking more Hebrew than we were.
Yeah.
After a while, the years pass and you're begging your children to read the electricity bill to you, and you can't help them with their homework.
Right.
And if something happens in their school, you can't walk in and help them sort it out.
Right.
There's this huge feeling of helplessness, and people look at you and wonder, how long are you going to stick around here, because they've seen so many people come and get discouraged and go. There wasn't that sense of commitment and permanence in the relationships, and so it was really difficult. And now I realize that's the experience of all refugees and all immigrants.
Right.
And I have a great compassion for people who are forced to leave their homes and start afresh somewhere else. In fact, years later, we were privileged to be able to start a shelter here for refugees and reach out to strangers who have walked across the borders of Israel. And so we've been able to share out of compassion what we learned in those early days of difficulty as new immigrants here.
What is that like when you see, there's obviously a lot of tragedy going on, not that far from where we're sitting right now. A lot of displaced people who are victims of horrible circumstances, and they literally, as you said, walk across the border. So what's it like to take them in and to try to give them some sense of hope in their life?
Well, what we've learned is that this nation, Israel, it really, biblically and prophetically, it's the center of the world. This is where the worlds are in collision.
Yeah.
And our entire region is in a massive and historical era of change. All the old colonial borders are being erased, different people groups. It's really what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24. He said, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be wars and famines in various places. These are the beginning of birth pangs. We feel those birth pangs. We have a contraction, a crisis, and then a period of calm. But we know we're just getting ready for another contraction, another crisis is coming. And so all around us in Africa and the Middle East, people are being forced from their homes by the hundreds of thousands, and in the case of Syria, by the millions. And some have, the ones from Africa, actually escaped genocide in Darfur out of Sudan in the early years, before the creation of South Sudan. Of course, that is now descended into civil war. They walked up the Nile into Egypt and then met tragedy and mistreatment, abuse in Egypt. And so some of them, this was 12 or 13 or 14 years ago, were paying Bedouin guides to take them into the Sinai and point them in the direction of the Israeli border, and they were walking into Israel.
Wow.
And so we started a shelter for the women and the children, many of them widows, and some of the children who were orphaned, really to obey the biblical command to care for the stranger.
Right.
And these people were really strangers like us. They had no language skills. They didn't know how to. They couldn't work. They had no legal status. They had no advocacy for them in the government. And so we began taking care of some of them. We really believe that the Bible teaches that our faith without works is not useful.
Yeah.
And that if we really believe the right things, we're going to do the right things. And particularly, the Lord commands us to reach out to the widows and to the orphans, to the helpless and to the needy. So this is part of our ministry expression of our faith, and that is to reach out to the stranger, to the refugee, to those women who are seeking asylum. They don't have their husbands are lost. Some are back in Eritrea. Their families have been torn apart. Some of these women have been trafficked on their way across the Sinai, and they come to us in pretty rough shape, some of them. So we're taking care of a number of women and an even larger number of children. Over 100 children have been actually born over the years to women who've been seeking shelter here. They know that they're going to get better treatment in Israel. And so we try to be a part of that. God's compassionate. And here we have this activity called Africa's Heart, where they make handbags, and it's really to give them an activity, so that they can do something that's useful, give them a sense of purpose and dignity, and sell these bags, and all the profits, all the proceeds, of course, go directly to the women.
That's wonderful, wonderful work. So it's interesting from your own personal experience in following a calling. When you came here all those years ago, would you have envisioned that you'd have this kind of shelter being taken care of these types of refugees? I mean,
when this happened to us, our congregation was already maturing. Okay,
right.
Our congregation was already 15 years old, and we were growing, and we knew we were more confident of our call to reach the Jews and the Arabs of Israel, and to build and to plant congregations, to teach, and to raise up a messianic remnant that hadn't been around for 2,000 years. I mean, that was consuming us. So the idea of now caring for African refugees who are really out of our scope was, we struggled with it.
Yeah.
We struggled with it, and until the Lord finally had to show us this was the call of the chosen people, was to care for the stranger.
Yeah.
And something that I think touches the heart of God. And certainly we learned so many things by the process of learning to accept them and really to make them part of this community.
So this is interesting then about the inspiration, because as I'm looking at how you answered a calling to come here in the first place, so something when you came to faith inspired inside of you to say, okay, we're going to do things, we're going to do radical things based on this. But then I think would you describe, and I'd like to understand how you experience it, that what that was, and if that was more kind of an internal thing, and then is it inspiration from the external work, like working with these refugees?
Right.
Is that a similar type of inspiration, different? How do you experience it?
It's both biblical and experiential. Mm-hmm. I think what originally lit the fuse of our passion to come to Israel and to become a part of this nation was the biblical understanding that it was the people of Israel who gave us this one book that tells us about God. Mm-hmm. And it's written by Israeli Jews, and it was preserved by Israeli Jews, and then the apostles and Jesus himself were Israeli Jews. And now there is an Israel, again, a nation alive from the dead after nearly 2,000 years. I guess we thought as new believers, why wouldn't you go, right? why wouldn't you go if you had the chance? And so when we came, I mean, Israel was less than 40 years old as a modern nation. Yeah. And we saw an opportunity, and we really felt God was drawing us into this, to become a part of this nation and participate in not only building up the nation, but reestablishing a messianic witness, like there was back in the days of the book of Acts, and actually before the days of the book of Acts, right. Okay, when it was Jesus and his disciples walking and serving and ministering right in this part of the country. So that was an amazing excitement. And then when we got here, in spite of the difficulties, as we began to meet those and overcome those challenges, what we realized is this nation is so rich not only in history and archaeology, but it's almost as if spiritually it's a place where God has hidden secrets. Mm-hmm. Knowing that we would come, right, 2,000 years later, right, and rediscover these things. Even just the geography. If you love the Bible, mm-hmm, the geography tells you about the Bible.
Yes.
They went from here to here, and now we know how long it took them. Okay, for example, that Cana, where Jesus performed his first miracle, in a car, it's less than 5 minutes drive from Nazareth. So
right.
So how long did it take them to walk? Well, probably about half an hour. So that means they knew everybody there, right? And maybe that explains why Mary, Jesus' mother, has so much authority there. It's probably relatives of Jesus, and she's been asked to kind of MC the wedding. So these things become more obvious from just knowing how the land is laid out, and why they mention this city and that city, and why they walked from here to there, and when he's in Lebanon meeting with the Syrophoenician woman, they didn't get there by accident. You don't get there by accident, right, not on foot.
Right.
You walk several days. So
right,
he was there on purpose. And Caesarea Philippi is the same thing, up near the Lebanese border. So much we began to learn, and then of course when you go to Jerusalem, it's just layer upon layer of secrets. And the archaeologists, of course, are digging down historically, but biblically things are being revealed. And I think really it's a sign that we've entered the final chapter, really the end times, and God is preparing ourselves and Christians everywhere for the last part of this great story.
Yeah, it seems that the story of the Bible is so much a story of this land, and there's people and and characters in it, but the land somehow comes to life, and it's very different being here and walking it.
Absolutely, this is where our roots are. You know, the name Israel is mentioned in the Bible more than any other name. I think it's more than 2,300 times. Wow. More than Jesus, more than God, more than any other thing. Israel, and of course, the land is the land of Israel. Yeah. And so it's really is our roots, not just the roots of the Jewish people, not just the roots of the Arab people, but every Christian, we receive that spirit of adoption, whereby we call the God of Israel Abba, Father. Okay. And we know from the writings of Paul that by faith we have become the children of Abraham. Right. And of course the prophecy of Malachi is to turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers. I tell people the fathers aren't Martin Luther and John Calvin or Billy Graham. Mm-hmm. Okay? The fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right. And when we Christians begin to really get that sense, the Bible becomes many times richer than if we're only understanding and focusing on the New Testament.
For someone who doesn't have faith, how would you describe what the experience is or what the inspiration feels like experientially? And maybe even existentially?
Well, maybe I should start with my own story in brief. You know, I was not raised in a believing family. We went to church, but I came to the conclusion when I was like 13 that not only did I not believe, no one in the church really believed. Right. We were just all going through the motions. Right. So I didn't go back into a church really for 10 years. Mm-hmm. But what brought me back was the death of my best friend, who was my roommate in our university in the Boston area. And he killed himself, and I had tried my best to convince him not to do it. I mean, he'd shared his feelings with me, he'd shared his plans with me, we had talked for weeks about it. And so when there was even an incident where he was from Denver. I'd gone out to his home and he'd bought a handgun. And I was 22 years old. I'd never done anything in my life, but I wanted to save him. I didn't know what to do. One afternoon, we were out in the fields out towards Kansas, all alone, and I took the gun from him. And these crazy thoughts are racing through my mind. I thought, well, what should I do? I have to do something. Maybe I should shoot myself. If I shot myself, maybe I could save him. And then I thought, no, that might not work, And then I had a terrible thought right after that, and it was this: that even if I knew that by taking my own life I would save him, I still wouldn't do it, because the bottom line was that to me my life was more precious than his. So later, when I met real born again people, they challenged me. They said, "Well, Jesus died for you," and a year earlier, I would have said, "Why? Did I ask him to do that? What a waste, But after I'd had that experience with my friend and lost my friend, I suddenly, I wanted to know. I said, wait a minute, are you telling me that this Jesus, he thinks my life is more important than his? He's the kind of person that he would make a decision that he would give up his life just so that I could live?" And they went, yeah. Exactly. But they didn't know what I'd been through, and so that's why I said to them, "Well, tell me more about him." And that really started this search and this biblically and coming to faith and realizing that it's not just a biblical story, but it's he's alive by his Spirit. That's the testimony of these men who wrote the Bible. Right. That he's not dead. He rose from the grave, and his spirit is alive. Now, as a 20-some-year-old young person and as a teenager, I had drug experiences. I'd been on hallucinogens and other drugs, and I'd had spiritual experiences. I knew there was a spirit world, but I'd never met the Spirit of God. And these first Christians in the United States, they told me, God is a spirit, and you need to worship him in spirit and in truth. I said, how do you do that? They said, pray. I said, what's prayer? They said, talk to God. I said, that's it. No book. No, I don't recite something. I don't have to sign anything. I don't have to join anything. They said, no, it's just you and God. You talk to him, and when you really mean it, he's going to send his spirit will come to you. So I said, okay, so what's this spirit like? I mean, I'd had very spooky, dark spiritual experiences up until then. They said the Spirit of God is just like Jesus. And I said, well, I know something about Jesus. He's a good man. He didn't advocate violence. Okay, I could meet that spirit. So I would just walk out into the desert. This was in New Mexico. I'd walk out into the desert and talk to God. And maybe it felt strange, but about the third or fourth day, I really felt there was a presence there. And there was something from the very start. I connected this. This is the God of Israel. This is the God of the Jewish people. And so when a personal relationship was established and I'd gone through the basics of repentance and forgiveness and what is the Bible and who is God and what is he like and how to approach him, there was just this fire was lit. I've got to find out about Israel. Because somehow Israel, to me, was from the start was the evidence.
Right.
You know, if this story is more than a good story, okay, if this story is more than just religion, then the evidence will be in Israel. So I knew from the start we'd at least have to come. I didn't know in the very beginning that we would end up living our lives here.
Wow. So, you made a distinction which is interesting that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because you said, you're experiencing some form of spirituality, as you were experimenting with, hallucinogens, what have you. But that's different than what it means to have your faith now and what that experience is. Can you make the distinction?
Well, the distinction is what spirit you end up in contact with.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was doing all kinds of things and looking for spiritual reality in peyote and mescaline and Native American religions, and I was having experiences. I knew there was stuff out there, but for me personally, most of it was frightening, and dark, and even demonic. I mean, even then, without knowing the Bible, I knew that some of it was just demonic, was evil.
Yes.
And so I was getting to the point where I didn't want to have those experiences anymore. And that was when I met the Christians. They said, well, you need to meet the Spirit of God. And that's why I asked them, so what is your God's Spirit like?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm not sure if I want to meet just any spirit. And I think that's the differentiation. I mean, God is alive, but there are other gods. Right. The world is ask the Hindus. They know there's millions of gods. My ancestors from Japan. Okay, there's a God for every neighborhood. There's a God in every shrine. Okay, there's lots of gods out there, and native people in just about every culture on the planet know that's true.
Right.
But this book tells about this God, and it's more than just a spiritual experience. It was when that spiritual experience came into focus and aligned with facts.
Yeah.
Facts, history, land, people. It just kind of got a lock on me, and I realized I had to pursue this and find out more, and that's one of the things that led us here.
What's interesting is that, and I think that's a big part of the point. This isn't just some kind of a whimsical, mystical experience,
right,
with a spirit.
Right.
There's a lot of history and a lot of things that have unfolded that are at this point well documented. And through this process with Christ Revealed, having interviewed many of these biblical archaeologists and the people in the apologetics community, and looking at how it all comes together. I mean, there's a deep amount or comprehensive sphere of history and evidence that continues to unfold to support it. So now you're here living in it, and more comes out. In your work that you do here, what have you seen as far as inspiration in people that come to your congregation here?
Well, the amazing thing is that we're seeing more and more Israeli Jews open their hearts to Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. And it's really an amazing thing. The older generation really has deep, deep wounds from the Holocaust. When we first arrived here 30 years ago, it was not uncommon. You'd see elderly people on the bus holding onto the strap, and you'd notice that on their arm and there was the concentration camp tattoos.
Yeah.
And we met Holocaust survivors. We shared our faith with some of them, and what we found is that many of them came back as survivors from that systematic mass murder, that genocide, shaking their fist at God. Some of them saying to God, "I'll never believe in you again. How could you have allowed this to happen to our people?" And we saw this brokenness, and it wasn't just hostility to the name of Jesus. It was just a brokenness, an inability to even deal with the concept of God again. But now, the younger Israelis, the ones who've been born and raised in this land and are growing up now, it's a really different attitude. The land, in a sense, is healing them. And now there's a growing interest in this. Who is this Yeshua? Who is this Jesus, this Israeli Jew who changed the world? I know, even among non-believing Jews, there's the beginning of this sense. Whether we believe in him or not, that's another thing.
Right.
But let's be honest, this is the guy who did more to change the world than Sigmund Freud or Karl Marx or Albert Einstein or even Steven Spielberg. Okay, this guy, he's a giant. Okay, so there's even some non-believing Israeli Jews, which is new in this country, that are beginning to say, so why, if we need to know about him, if we want to know about him, why do we have to go to the foreigners? Okay?
Right.
How come our people aren't teaching us everything we need to know about this Israeli Jew who changed the world? So there's a generational change taking place, and I think that's the most remarkable thing. The Jesus of history is really becoming the living Jesus for people like myself, but also now for members of a new generation of Israelis.
So in summing all this up, is there any words of inspiration that you might have for people who are watching this right now?
I would say, for Christians everywhere, we should all realize we're the first Christians in 2,000 years who can come to a nation called Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people. And not only that, the first Christians in 2,000 years, that once we come to this land, we can find our way into a house of worship where Jesus is being worshipped by his own people, in his own land, in his own language for the first time in 2,000 years. The last time this happened, they wrote about it in the book of Acts.
Right.
Now you can get off a plane, and like you've done, you can come in and see it with your own eyes. It's something you can touch with your own hands. And first of all Christians should go, wow, I'm part of a chosen generation. This is an amazing fact. But then I believe we need to open our hearts and allow the implications of that fact, of that truth to sink in. It means that God is in the business, okay, of changing the world and finishing what he started and keeping all of his promises. And it should lead us back into the Bible with renewed interest. And I would also say that all Christians somehow, they need to come here.
Yeah.
Find a way to come to Israel, see this place, and learn what God is doing here.
Well, I've only been here for a few days, and I can't help but agree with you.
Okay, that's good.
So much so. It's been an amazing experience, and thank you so much for bringing all this to life here. It was an amazing representation and conversation, so thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Patrick. It's my pleasure.
Welcome back to studio. Right now we have the final interview with Greg Koukl. What was that like?
Well, By now, you've seen 2 parts of our 3-part Greg Koukl interview, and you know that he's a very precise thinker with very passionate arguments for the faith of Christianity. So now we're going to bring it all together in the last part of our interview with him, which is part 3. So tune in, lean in, clear your mind. You're going to get some great stuff out of this. Well, speaking of turbulence, so it seems that in recent years, the atheists have really scaled up their assertions about the existence of God, or that you can't prove the existence of God, etc. So that's another one, I think, of the big challenges.
Sure,
right
it
now.
is. They're selling a lot of books.
Yeah.
There's the front 4: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris, known as the new atheist. But there's a whole lot of people that are riding their coattails and taking advantage of the surge, which I think in some way got a leg up at 9/11, because here was a religiously motivated disaster. 2,977 innocent people lost their lives in 9/11, and this got a lot of people bugged about dogmatic religious claims. And so these guys had a field day. Chris Hitchens' book was How Religion Poisons Everything.
Right.
So God is not good, how religion poisons everything. And so I think they were able to get some traction. Now, what they did is they created a kind of a trend that I don't know how long it's going to last. It's starting to abate just a little bit right now, but it certainly is a trend in which it's become sophisticated to be an atheist, and they're getting more respect in a certain way. And I guess they've considered themselves somewhat personas non grata in the past, because you have to believe in God to be a real citizen and a good person. And so they've advanced arguments to show not only that God doesn't exist, but it's the religious people that are the dangerous people, not the atheist. An atheist can be really good even without God, okay? And so this then presents a challenge for us, because our story starts in the beginning God. And if there's no God, there's no story, okay? And so it's become beholden upon us, I think, to be not only more visible with good arguments in favor of the existence of God and answering some of those challenges, but also making these arguments more accessible to the rank and file. Okay, and I think that's happened in response to the new atheists and others like them, that we have been able to take the cosmological argument and the teleological argument and the moral argument. See, these are fancy philosophical terms, but we can put them in language that people can understand. For example, the cosmological argument. What's that? Well, that's an argument for God based on the existence of the universe, the cosmos, okay? And it asks the question, why is something here rather than nothing? Okay? Now, here's the way I put it. Most people believe in the Big Bang, and I think there's justification in that. It doesn't create any problems for me. Some Christians don't like it, okay? But I don't think they see how well it fits into their story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Big Bang. There it is. This is perfectly consistent with our story. And the way I put it, to put a handle on it for people, is a Big Bang needs a Big Banger, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. And that is the cosmological argument, at least one form of it, in a nutshell, so to speak. Very accessible to people and very common sense. So when I talk to people on this issue, for example, to make it accessible, I say, well, I'll ask them a couple of questions. Do you think things exist? Yeah, of course I do. Do you think the things that exist always existed? No, they came into existence, like at the Big Bang. I said, okay, great. What caused the Big Bang? Oh, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. Oh, you don't have to be a scientist, because you only have 2 options. Either something or no thing.
Right.
I want to be careful with saying nothing, because some people start treating nothing like it's a kind of thing called nothing.
Exactly.
So that's why I want to say it's no thing, okay, that it had no cause. Either something or nothing. Now, that's pretty much a complete set of possibilities there. So what's he going to say? Now, the atheist doesn't want to say something, because the minute you say something caused everything else, then there's something outside of the everything else, and they don't want to say that.
Right.
Because their whole project is this everything else is all there is. And the something outside of it is going to have to be pretty smart, pretty powerful, and all of a sudden it's starting to sound like the G word there, God. They don't want to go there. But what's their only other alternative? It wasn't something, it was no thing. Now this is wildly counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
That's worse than magic, actually. Because in magic, you have a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, but in this case, you have no magician, and you have no hat. You just have the rabbit.
No thing.
The universe coming into existence.
Right.
And come on, who believes that kind of thing actually takes place? Now, you might want to say something can come from nothing like that without any cause. If you believe that, you're welcome to it. That's what I say.
Yeah.
But you got more faith, quote unquote, than I got.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's certainly not the odds-on favorite.
Right.
If your wife came home and saw in your garage that a Mercedes SL there, it said, honey, where did that Mercedes come from? Darling, it just popped into existence out of nothing. Happens all the time, That's the way they think the universe came to be, after all. You think any wife is going to believe that nonsense? No. So where's the smart money? That's my question here. Even if you want to say maybe something can come from nothing, is that the smart money? No, that's not the smart money. The smart money is on something, and the minute you say something, you're in my camp. Mm-hmm. Okay? That's God, all right? And so that's just one little piece of evidence. I think that the way I described it, quite accessible, pretty straightforward, and very commonsensible. And there's a whole raft of things like that we can point to.
So the corollary now is science and Christianity, right?
Right. Well, this is there's this conflict, and I'm just going to tell you, this is contrived. This is a contrived conflict. It started at the end, towards the end of the 19th century. Before that, there was no such thing as a conflict between science and religion. And if you think about virtually all of the fathers of major disciplines of science, whether it's Kepler or Faraday, or whether it's Gregor Mendel, the monk, or whether it's Newton himself, they were all biblical theists. And rather than religion being a science stopper, which the atheists say nowadays, it was a science starter. Mm-hmm. Science started in the fertile soil of a Christian worldview. These people convinced that an intelligent God made an intelligible world that followed certain patterns that we could discover to use for ourselves and learn something about the Creator. Okay, so it wasn't until the late 19th century that Enlightenment sensibilities started to inveigh against the existence of God and used science to do it, okay? So there's nothing about the methodologies of science that preclude God's involvement in specialized circumstances when the evidence seems appropriate, like the origin of the universe or the origin of life. These are two singularities, so to speak, that are examples of the kind of thing that science, let me put it this way, naturalistic, mechanistic explanations are not going to do. Right. It just, it's just not going to, you're not going to get something from nothing using scientific principles. It doesn't work that way. Okay, science works with the natural world. It doesn't explain how the natural world came to be. And when it comes to the nature of life, life is very complex and it's run on information. That's what the DNA double helix is all about. Well, who wrote those books? You got to have new information going into the genome for life to develop, okay? And so all attempts to explain that by a naturalistic process has failed miserably. Okay, so why, if the evidence points to God, why can't we invoke intelligence when it seems in evidence? Okay, so a forensic pathologist will go to a crime scene and look for a fingerprint. Okay, is that unscientific? No, he's using the science to find the bad guy or the person who did it. Okay, well, that's what we're doing. using science to find the person who did it, the big thing, the universe. Why is now that disqualified? We're talking about God, okay? And that seems to be a false move. And there's a reason for this happening, though. And the reason that it happens, the reason that science that points to a designer is not science but religion, is because there's another religion in play. And that religion is called materialism. Now, maybe saying it's a religion is a little self-serving, but because there's no God in materialism, that's the competition. Materialism is just a view of the world that says the only thing that exists are material things in motion, okay? But that's the competing religion, okay? And so what has happened is a scientific methodology which is perfectly fine and adequate to its own task. And many Christians have used in the past, like I mentioned. Now it has been hijacked by a different religion called materialism, which says that whatever way you use your methodology is fine as long as it doesn't violate the principles of materialism, okay? As long as your methodology doesn't indicate something that exists that is immaterial, like God, or souls, or something, or even consciousness.
I'd say consciousness is
I know. See, this is the craziest thing, because Daniel Dennett, one of the new atheists, now he's saying, and you could go to YouTube and look it up, Daniel Dennett, consciousness is an illusion, and now you're going to get the YouTube. He's sitting in his easy chair out on the patio talking all about it,
Right.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, the materialists would look at consciousness as just an epiphenomenon of the brain, basically.
They might say that,
Yeah.
but this is what Daniel's saying,
He's saying
because
it's
an
not even that.
epiphenomena, which would be like a spin-off result of the brain, kind of, would be would still be something.
Right.
But there are problems with that view that you just described, and so Daniel Dennett is going to say, well, believe it or not, consciousness is just an illusion. Really? Now, why has he got to say it? Because he doesn't fit in his materialistic box.
Right.
But it's, pardon me, but it's a foolish thing to say.
Yes.
And the reason is because you can ask yourself, what is an illusion? Well, an illusion is when your consciousness is being appeared to in a distorted or false way.
I was going to say you're conscious of something.
You have to be conscious in order to have an illusion. So what's having the illusion? Another illusion. You can see how this is just
infinite regress.
Well, they end up saying things that are just, again, wildly counterintuitive and foolish, because there's no way out for them.
Right.
Okay? But see, this is what's going on in this so-called battle between science and, now they're going to say, faith. Science and faith. See, it's just another way of marginalizing our view. Oh, that's just that faith stuff. That's not the knowledge stuff. We got that in science. That's this faith stuff that you just conjure up, you know. So about 10 years ago, no, it was about 20 years ago now. Time flies. But there was an article written in the New York Review of Books by Richard Lewontin, Lewontin. Richard Lewontin was a Harvard geneticist at the very top of the pecking order of these things, you know, in the scientific community. And he wrote a piece that he dedicated to Carl Sagan, who had just died. It was about Sagan. It was called Billions and Billions of Demons is the title of the article. It's easy to look up, though. That's why I'm giving you some information here so people viewing here can just check it out.
Right.
Because what I'm about to tell you is going to stun people, okay? In that article, there's a long quote where Lewontin actually describes the true battle between science and religion. And he admits it's contrived. That is, it's not the methodologies of science that require us to come to conclusions that are materialistic, but it's rather our imposed philosophy of materialism, our a priori commitment to materialism is the way he puts it.
Right.
That means before the evidence is in, that force us to accept what he calls just so stories, or concepts that are beyond common sense or contrary to common sense, because of this commitment. And then his famous line, why rig the game this way? And he says, because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, quote, unquote. There it is. Richard Lewontin, one of the brightest minds in the business, is admitting to the world that the game is rigged. And he's not the only one who's done that. There have been many more, but his is the most famous example because it's so bold and unapologetic. And he does it before the world. The New York Review of Books. So this is what's going on. there is a conflict.
Yeah.
But it has to do with the way science is now arbitrarily defined based on a philosophic commitment that itself is hostile to anything somebody might characterize as religious.
Yeah.
You let science just do its thing in terms of its general methodology and follow the facts where they lead, follow the evidence where it leads, without this bias, without this external disqualifying element, well, then I think you're going to come up with entirely different answers. And I think the intelligent design crowd has done a really good job in showing how the evidence we have from the natural world, read science here,
Yeah.
points to a God in lots of powerful ways. So this is all on my side here. When it comes to the science and faith kind of so-called battle, that's all contrived.
Yeah.
I can go to science and use the evidence of science to bear testimony to the existence of God, which is the same thing that Paul said. We referred to it earlier, that everybody has at their disposal the faculties to know that God actually does exist. And now in the scientific age, we have that material in spades because we're so good at looking at the world.
So, perfect segue because you're talking about books
Yes.
and certain books that are written. You've written books.
I have a few.
You have
as
a
it
few
turns
books,
out.
and you could write about a lot of subjects. Obviously, in this conversation, you cover a lot of ground, many areas of interest, decades of study, and precision in thinking. You know, I could see how precise your thinking and words are. What books did you write, and why did you choose those particular subjects?
Well, I've actually written 7 now, and the ones I think that are most important, I'll just talk about 3 because they really fit a particular paradigm. I don't actually like writing. I write because it's something I'm capable of doing for an important purpose. I'm entrusted with a stewardship. That's the way I look at it. And so I want because I don't particularly enjoy the process, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I want what I write to be durable, and it will only be durable if it speaks to important things in a way that people can understand and apply. Okay, so the first book that I wrote it with a colleague, Dr. Frank Beckwith, and the book was called Relativism, and the subtitle is Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. And this is where we take on the topic of moral relativism and in its various forms, and why culture has embraced it in different ways, and the impact it has, for example, on the question of abortion or on sexual issues and other policy concerns in our culture. And then what objective morality says about the existence of God. So that book is over 20 years old, almost 20 years old, and it's still selling,
Right.
and it's still meeting a need because the problem is still there.
Yes.
The second book I wrote that's in this category is a book on maneuvering in conversations. Some of the material, most of the material people read in the area that we're talking about now is information stuff.
Right.
Okay, good stuff. We need it. But how do you get the information into play?
Right.
Okay.
What's the title of this book?
This book is called Tactics.
Tactics, okay.
A game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. So I actually chart out a plan, a step-by-step way of approaching conversations so they look more like diplomacy than D-Day, okay?
Right.
A lot of times it ends up too crazy, you know, and we don't want to go there. We want it to be pleasant and nice for people. And so what I noticed is that there's a missing bridge, and the bridge from the content to the conversation. So how do you get the information into play? And so that's where the material in this book comes from, or what it addresses. And what I show people to do, a number of maneuvers in conversations that will help them in conversations, but the core enterprise is a technique of using questions to maneuver effectively in conversation. Now I call it the Columbo tactic because of Lieutenant Columbo. Remember that guy? He's always scratching his head, smoking a cigar, and I don't know, something about this thing bothers me, you know, that kind of thing. And then he asks the question. It's very simple to use and very, very effective, the way I lay it out for folks. So that's the second book, and this is
in that book, and with developing that skill that you're describing here. I'm kind of asking a leading question here, but
It's okay.
do you find that because somebody, as you develop that skill, it actually self-empowers? Not even. I mean, there's obviously the issue of being able to be effective in communication, but the more that you become effective in being able to communicate, your own conviction can grow also.
Yeah, I think what happens more than in that situation, more than the conviction growing, is the courage to communicate. The conviction grows.
Yes.
Because there's two things that, well, probably more, but two things I think of that create courage, and one is preparation. Okay, if you got a plan, then you can put on your game face and execute.
Right.
Even though you're like, oh, okay, we got a plan.
Right.
And then execute is action. You move.
Right.
You start moving, and that helps you. So if people who are nervous and sitting on the sidelines, sitting on the bench, are given a plan and encouraged to just move forward a little bit, they're going to do it, or more likely to do it. And so what I tell people regarding this material is I say, you don't have to swing for the fences. Use my baseball metaphor here. I say, you don't even have to get on base.
Yeah.
That is, you don't have to lead people to Christ, or don't worry about that yet. You don't have to be a great apologist. You don't have to be a great theologian. You don't have to even get on base. I just want you to get into the batter's box. And this game plan will help you to do that. Now, this book is a bestseller as it's turned out over the last 8 years since it's been out. And there's a study guide out and everything on it now, tactics. But I also wrote a book that just came out earlier this year, 2017, in January. And the title of that book, which is going to sound familiar because I've been working into our conversation here this whole hour or so that we've been talking, is The Story of Reality. How the world began, how it ends, and everything important that happens in between.
Wow.
Okay. Now, sounds like a lot. The word important is really important there to the title because it isn't world history. It's less than 200 pages. But what I do is I look 30,000 feet kind of view of Christianity, the big picture, so people don't get lost in the details. I mean to show how it all fits together, not only so Christians can understand it, but for tire kickers who are thinking about what's going on here. I can show the coherence and continuity of the Christian worldview from beginning to end in a way that makes sense of the world as we experience it. Back to that earlier comment to my daughter, it's the best explanation for the way things are.
Right.
And earlier when I was talking about some of the core concepts of Christianity, I actually walked through my outline from the book, because the outline can be given with 5 words.
Go ahead.
And those words are God, man, Jesus, cross, and resurrection. Okay, and here I mean the final resurrection, of course secured by the resurrection of Jesus, which I do speak about, but I'm talking about the end. So I got the beginning, I got the end, and I got everything important that happens in between. And you think about it, it's all the important things that happen in the order they took place.
Right.
So you have, which by the way makes it memorable. It's just 5. I just did it on my fingers.
Right.
My 9-year-old, when she was 6, she could do this. God, man, Jesus, cross, resurrection. Because our story starts with God, and then he makes the most valuable thing in creation, human beings, to be in friendship with him. But then man got himself in a heap of trouble that required that he get rescued. And so God becomes a man in Jesus to initiate the rescue operation. He accomplishes that by the way he lives his life and something he does on a cross, and what we believe about what he did on the cross will determine what happens to us in the final resurrection. So there's kind of the big picture. And I intended it to be kind of and please forgive me for the comparison, but I wanted it to be like a Mere Christianity for a new generation. Now, I'm a little uncomfortable saying that because C.S. Lewis is in a class entirely by himself, and there will never be another, okay? And that's also true of Mere Christianity. But a lot of people find that Mere Christianity is not as accessible for them now as it would have been to an earlier generation. It was written, I think, in 1951. And so my attempt is to write in a kind of accessible style of Lewis, covering a lot of the same ground that he did, and in an affable manner, a genial way. It's like we're doing now.
Right.
We're just sitting down and talking, and I'm talking with the reader. I'm not talking at the reader. I'm not talking to myself or the reader listening in. I'm talking with the reader and engaging him and trying to anticipate objections to what I had just said and then answering them. And so my hope is that this will fill a niche not only for younger Christians who want to lay a foundation or for older Christians to clarify the foundation, but this is a book that any Christian can give to a non-Christian friend without embarrassment, because I'm not condescending, I'm not patronizing, I'm not overly triumphal in this, you know, and I'm not using a bunch of Christian lingo. I'm just talking like a human being, much like I think we've been talking here in our conversation, in a way that's accessible to people, but still making the case that Christianity is the best explanation for the way things are. Okay, so those are the three big titles, and there's some spin-offs that are in the works for them. But I think if people are interested in learning about some of the things that I've said here, then those would be sources they could go to get some really good working knowledge that will help them engage their friends, their acquaintances, other family members.
So with this kind of integrated view of reality, or let's talk about, you know, saying there is a view of reality.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a fundamental or innate human need to have an integrated view of reality, a way to be able to have things kind of come together and say, okay, now I have a view of reality that I can embrace?
Yeah. Human beings are truth seekers by nature, okay? And some atheists have made the observation that we look to make sense out of things, all right? And therefore, because we have this tendency, they are dismissive of intelligent design arguments. Oh, we're just telling ourselves story. We find patterns, right? Okay, well, just because, and so that's a way of dismissing what seems to be a pattern of intelligent design. But I think that objection defeats itself. Because maybe we're finding patterns, which strikes me as a design feature itself. Okay, that's one thing. But secondly, we're finding patterns that are real patterns. I mean, they seem to think that they found a pattern in Darwinian evolution, and it's not enough for me to say to the Darwinists, oh, we're just pattern-finding creatures and just wave my hand so that evolution goes away. That's not the way to treat that kind of idea. And so I think that we are pattern-finding creatures because there are patterns to be found. And one of the patterns, the most meaningful pattern that we're looking for, is a pattern that makes sense of our own existence. What's it all about? That's a question that is at the heart of every human being, and they ask it at some time in their lives. Now, sometimes people are so distracted by pleasure, people are wealthy enough to distract themselves from the big thing. They can just kind of keep feeding their own senses and keep them distracted. But I think most ordinary people realize that there is meaning to be found, and we're not just wishing on a star when we're looking for it. C.S. Lewis has a famous argument called An Argument from Desire. And essentially it is, we feel thirsty because there are things that can slake our thirst. If there was nothing to satisfy thirst, there would be no thirst feeling. The same thing with hunger and sexual desire and a host of other things. But he says we also have a desire for something else. We have a desire for justice, for example, and justice is not done in this life, on this earth. Therefore, there must be a place where justice is done. There is meaning. We have, as one of the prophets put it, eternity in our hearts. It's built into us, gives us a hunger for these things. And all of these things suggest that there is a place, in principle at least, where those hungers can be satisfied. They are not satisfied in this world. They must be satisfied in another. It's a huge theme in Lewis's writings, and it's one I develop in The Story of Reality as well, this yearning that we have. So when Lewis says that the door that we've been knocking on all of our lives will finally open, he's referring to this existential yearning and hunger, desire that you just identified for meaning in our life. There is a door that we can go through that will answer all of those questions. But we don't have to wait to the end of life to know that there's a door to go through. We can be on a path towards that door now, and we have clues to that the author of the story has already given us. And those are the clues that we can discover without reading the story. You know, some things are obvious and other things the author has to tell us. And that's where we go to the Bible, the ancient Hebrew prophets, Jesus of Nazareth, and the people who Jesus taught himself, personally taught, to follow after him. And these are the places we can go for insight into these things. And I think when we read these things, and we give it a chance, we don't read it necessarily with a skeptical eye, because it's not charitable to pick up any author and just read him with a skeptical eye. Why don't we just let the guy speak for himself and see what resonates with you? And I think that what people will find is that when they read these accounts and what Jesus had to say and what the prophets had to say, man, something happens inside. It resonates with a deep intuition. It provides answer to this question about meaning that churns in all of us at one time or another.
So this brings me to my last question for you.
All right.
You lead a robust intellectual life. You've done a lot of thinking, you've written books, and you have a, maybe mischaracterized, but let's call it a Christian intelligence.
Okay.
And
I'm okay with that. That sounds
okay.
good. I'd not heard the phrase before,
Okay.
so thank you.
Great. So you have this Christian intelligence that's earned, and it's earned over a lot of time and a lot of effort. But there's also, to go with it, a Christian heart.
Yes. Indispensable.
And that's what I want you to speak to now, because the passion and the intellectual passion is all there. And then there's this, now you characterize it as an indispensable Christian heart.
Right.
Can you just give me your sentiments around that,
Sure.
even in a personal way?
Yeah. It would be fair to say that the entire enterprise is about that. Mm-hmm. When Jesus came, and this is a fairly famous line at the Last Supper, he said, he breaks the bread, he gives the wine, he said, this is the blood of a new covenant. Mm. This is my body broken for you. What new covenant? Where did that come from? New Testament, new covenant. Oh, right. Well, that's why it's called that. Yes, Jesus was bringing something new, but it had been spoken of before. If you go back to the ancient Hebrew prophets like Jeremiah, mm-hmm. Jeremiah talks about a new thing God would do that he calls a new covenant or contract or agreement, whatever. And he says, though you have hearts of stone, I will give you a living heart. Mm. I will write my laws on your heart. So one of the provisions, or the core provision, is of the new covenant, which is the point of it all. Mm. It's the apex. It's what the whole story has been building towards, what God is giving us and made possible through Jesus, is a brand new heart restored from this broken, sullied, corrupted, twisted heart that was a result of the fall and we've inherited. Now we get a new heart. That's why Jesus said you must be born again. That's what he's talking about. Okay? And there's something new that's going to happen. Well, this is the new life. This is the whole point. This restored friendship, relationship with God that then allows us to track in the kind of direction that God wants us to track and to have the kind of life that he wants us to have. Jesus talks about eternal life, which sometimes we think about off in the future sometime. When I die, I'll get eternal life. But he didn't say that. And his last night, while he was alive, when he was with his apostles in that upper room, he prayed a prayer. He prayed a prayer to the Father. And in that prayer, he said, he talked about eternal life, and he said that they may know you. This is eternal life, that they may know you and your Son whom you've sent. So real life, it can be had right away, and that is that restored, renewed relationship with the Father. Mm-hmm. That's what it's all about. So there's a certain sense in which all that we have talked about has really been stepping stones to get people to the door where they enter into what it's really all about. Mm-hmm. That communion and union with God in that friendship that he intended with us from the beginning. Okay? And all this other stuff is fighting off the naysayers. people trying to drag you away from the path or the door or whatever, get to the door. No, don't go there. That's dumb. That's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. That's wrong. That's evil. That's bigoted. That's narrow-minded. Okay. So we're answering all of that stuff so we can get people to the door to meet the man Jesus, be restored to the Father. Back to a parable that Jesus describes, the son who goes away to a far country, and spends his money illicitly, and then he's left not free. Let's go back to the earlier comment about my own testimony. Yeah, do your own thing, it's free. No, it's free, it's slavery. Yeah. And he's slave, and he said, I should just go back to my Father. I do better as a servant than I'm doing here. Maybe he'll take me back. And as he goes back, his father is waiting and he's looking. And it's interesting how Jesus tells the parable, because it says that he sees and he speaks and he runs and he embraces. So it's the eyes of love, the mouth of love, the arms of love, the legs of love. It's all welcoming and pulling the Son. My son who is lost is now found. And see, that's what we want. We want people to go back to the Father. We want people to go back to the Father. Now, what happens when they go back to the Father? Well, they are restored to the right relationship with God. Now they're back in the family. But this is when the fun begins. And I kind of raise my eyebrows, because fun's not always fun when you're in the midst of it. Because we're a mess. Okay, and so even though we're made right with God because of what Jesus did for us, we still got a lot of learning to do. And this is when we embark on a lifetime existential journey with God as He puts us through our paces to raise us up as children into adults spiritually. That's not easy. Yeah. And that's not fun. So a lot of times you hear Christians, in my view, they're a little bit over-triumphal. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. Wow, fabulous. Isn't it great to know the Lord? He'll fix your marriage. He'll straighten out your kids. He'll straighten out your finances and get your business dealing all together. Wait a minute, that isn't what He promised. Does Jesus work? Depends what you expect Him to do. Some things He works really good for. Other things He wasn't intended to do. Okay, what God uses, what God does in our life is to make us like Jesus. That's His commitment, and He uses all the hardship of our lives and the joys, there's payoffs at different times, to do that, but that's a lifelong process. Jesus said, in this world you have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So my life, very personal now, my life I've been a Christian 43 or 44 years almost now, and it's not been easy. It's been a real challenge in a lot of ways. I'm not trying to be maudlin or have people feel sorry for myself, but I do want to be honest with folk. You want to walk with God, that's where you belong. And the alternative is not good, okay? But God's going to be a father to you. He's not Santa Claus. He's not your Uncle Harry who bought you all the gifts or whatever. He's not your wife. He's not a sexual partner. He is a good father who doesn't make mistakes, has your best interest in mind, and knows how to get you there. You want to walk in that road? That's reality. That is a story of reality.
Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much for sharing all of this with a lifetime of work with us here. And I'm very awed by the communication and the eloquence in which you do it. Oh, and I just want to say, on behalf of myself and everybody who's going to see this, that we have a deep appreciation for you. Thank you.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me to talk. Thank you.
Welcome back. Coming up now is the interview with Hermana. So tell us how that went.
Well, my interview with Hermana was quite captivating. Hermana is working with Father Kelly and Magdala and has really brought a light on that whole project and the female view of Christianity in general. So when you watch the interview, it's very engaging. I think it's very revealing in many ways, and it's something that I found to be profound. In addition to that, I'm realizing, my goodness, we're down to the end of episode 7 after this interview. Wow, I mean, the journey has been amazing. Hard to believe we're already here at episode 7 of our 9-part docuseries with Christ Revealed, the history, the evidence, the inspiration. But what I will promise you is that the next 2 episodes have amazing content that you want to engage in. It actually builds to a crescendo. So stay tuned with us. Also, I want to remind you that you can own Christ Revealed, and while the series is running right now, you can get it at 50% off the normal price. There's a variety of packages for you. We certainly appreciate the people who are supporting this project. There's a lot of great stuff to come, but I would definitely take advantage of getting it at 50% off right now. We certainly appreciate the support, and we're going to continue this amazing journey with you. So thanks for taking some time to speak with us today. This is a very inspired location right here near the Sea of Galilee. First, tell us just a little bit about your interests in education and your background.
Thank you for the privilege. It's a wonderful, wonderful honor. I did a degree in history and geography of Israel here in Jerusalem. And part of my course included archaeology, and I really wanted to do hands-on, an excavation. And I had the privilege to do so in 2012, which was about the fourth year of the discovery of Magdala. And so I was able to work here and just participate in the dig. And the synagogue that we discovered here is from the 1st century, 2,000 years old. And that was discovered in about 2009. So there are about 7 synagogues from this period in the country of Israel, but this one's the only one at the Sea of Galilee.
Wow. So this is interesting. So talk about how this all unfolded here. How did it become an archaeological site?
Yeah, it was kind of a surprise for Father Juan, the person that is the father, the visionary of the site. He wanted to build a guest house, a pilgrim center down at the Sea of Galilee. And that was his dream. And he wanted to have a boat and boats as a theme because of the fisher's disciples in the context of Jesus. He just didn't know that in the land that he was raising funds to purchase, there was actually an entire 2,000-year-old city underneath the ground.
Wow.
So in Israel, there's a law that if you want to build anything, the Israel Antiquities has to come and probe the soil. So they sunk 10 different squares, and everywhere they discovered something: channels, streets, houses, a harbor, and as I said, a synagogue, and also purification baths. Wow. So it became a sensation overnight.
And this is a synagogue that existed in Jesus' time
Yes.
when he was here, and this is the area that Jesus spent
Yes.
much of his time.
Yes, there are many, many synagogues in Israel, but there's only 7 from the 1st century. And some of them are at Masada, close to Jericho, near Tel Aviv, but it wasn't Jesus' area.
Right.
So like you say, this is the only one here at the Sea of Galilee, which allows us to see how it looked in the setting where he would have engaged people.
Wow.
So yeah, I don't know if you know that, but in archaeology we discovered a fishing industry, a salted fishing industry here. Josephus had his military headquarters here, so he wrote a few things about Magdala. And one of the things that he wrote is that there was a salted fishing industry. We actually discovered those fishing pools right next to one another. Actually like a shop. There's a street area, you come off the street into the shop, and then it has these basins that are plastered, and each one of them have a freshwater well. So it's very much a fishing town.
Yes.
You know, so like you say, right on the Sea of Galilee with all the elements of Jesus' disciples right here. So it's very exciting. And Josephus also says that from the fishing industry, they exported as far as Rome and Damascus, which gives an understanding of why archaeologists says the synagogue is the most beautiful and the best preserved. Josephus indicated that there was a huge economic benefit in this city.
And Josephus was the historian
That's
who
right.
wrote about this area.
Yeah.
And so then this becomes kind of interesting because so much of what's written in the Bible is corroborated
Yeah.
by an independent historian. And again, we're in the area of Jesus and understanding that right here on the Sea of Galilee where we are, fishing. There's still people out there fishing.
Yes.
2,000
Yes.
years later.
Yeah, I mean, if I look out the window, you can see, not there now, but early in the morning, you surely see a fishing boat and the nets.
Yes.
It's amazing. They're still doing it.
Yeah, that's incredible. So one of the prime discoveries, I guess, that came out of the dig is they call it the Magdala Stone.
Yeah, that's right.
So tell us about that.
In the synagogue, almost in the center of it, we discovered a stone, which is called the Magdala Stone, that has, I don't even know how to describe, probably about 3/4 of a meter to half a meter in its parameters, also half a meter high. And this is the first time that we find anything that represents the temple at the time of Jesus. So on the front side of this carved stone, it's a beautiful sculpture. We have the oldest menorah in Israel that we've ever found in archaeology. On the back side, we have a primitive expression of the chariot of fire, God's mobile throne. On the sides, you have the colonnades, and on the top, we have several symbols, the largest of them, which is a rosette that has become the insignia of Magdala. So right now, that stone is in Rome on display. And we have 2 replicas available here for people who visit the site that can look at it and discuss it.
Now, we are in the area that Mary Magdalene is from.
That's
correct?
right.
And hence Magdala it describes this particular area.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, as we sit here in this church, and I looked, I was getting some of the interpretations of the inscriptions that are around us, and it brings forth the understanding of the feminine in Scripture. And you've been having some experience, I guess, with this particular topic. Can you speak to that a little bit and what you've been doing?
Yeah. I'm glad you noticed that because the artist was very careful to give the worship center the shape of a woman. So there are a lot of rounded shapes,
Yes.
and the colors are more muted than you normally see in Tiberias. In Tiberias and the Galilee area, you'll see black stone and white stone in sharp contrast, but over here it's brown and beige. And then in the atrium behind me, there are these columns that have been shaped according to Greek architecture, the exact parameters, but it has a feminine, a slender shape.
Yes.
And on each one of them are the names of New Testament women, more than one.
Right.
So there's Mary and Martha, there's the mother-in-law of Peter, there is several other names, Mary Magdalene, etc., and then one column without a name. And the reason for this women's atrium, which is where you read the inscription, is that Father Juan said, if Mary Magdalene got healed of 7 demons, then other women must also find hope and healing in this place.
Yes.
So he fondly sometimes say that every woman that loves God and lives by faith can write her name on the column that doesn't have a name on it. And then he says, my mother raised 13 children and she's worthwhile honoring.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a high priority for Father Juan, who felt that this center should represent the public life of Jesus, that specifically his tender treatment of women should be drawn forward, should be displayed. And so there's various places in this building where you see a focus on women.
And there's a particular part of the Scripture that I think you said speaks to this that I'd love for you to share with us.
Yes. In Luke 13, there's a moment where Jesus engages a woman in a synagogue. Now, the important thing here is to understand that even though later on women had a separate court in the temple, at this stage when they were still in the synagogue, it's open for women, for men, and for various kinds of approaches to religion, like we read of Sadducees, Pharisees. So Jesus' ministry is launched in a context where it's not homogeneous thinking. It's not just people that think in one direction. Like today, synagogues and churches would have a specific, like the Methodist or the Reformed synagogue. But over there, it was open. It was a public space. So first of all, these women in here, it says in Luke 13, verse 16, on a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, "There are 6 days for work. So come and be healed on those days, but not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each one of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" And when he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. Now, what strikes me about this passage is, number one, Jesus says to this man, he uses two extremes. First of all, he calls this woman a daughter of Abraham, which was unheard of. He elevates her dignity to a place where people were shocked, like only men were called sons of Abraham. And then he compares this man's hypocrisy, and he refers to animals. Now, if you see the context, the cultural context in which Jesus engaged women, you will understand that, especially from the Greek background, which influenced Roman thinking, which then had a profound effect upon Judaism, a woman was considered like an animal. In fact, Simonides, which came a little bit later than Homer, that wrote the first creation story of where a woman came about. Simonides said a woman came about by one of 10 animal sources: a donkey, a dog, a weasel, a fox. I think the most positive one is a bee. So when Jesus says to this man, "Your animal," you would have untied him. It's not an unfamiliar idea to them, because they believed that you could use a woman, you could enslave her, you could sell her, you could, in some cases, even you can kill her. So the civilization that had the worst attitude towards women were the Greeks. If you read their wise men and what they said, it is it's really shocking. But Jesus comes, and in that backdrop, he treats women with the greatest respect. And he spends the longest recorded conversation with the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well. So we see that very soon there was a following of women that went after him. And it says in Luke 8, verse 2, that some of these women supported him with their means. Also at the cross, when the men leave, Mary Magdalene remains, and his mother and several of the other women.
Yes.
So, yeah, there was Jesus had a profound, I almost would dare to say, a revolutionary approach towards women.
Yeah.
And
it seems again that here, from almost the moment you come in, the Magdala Stone, you come into this church. There's an honoring of the feminine, in this place. Now, you've also been having, I guess, interaction with women, in Israel, and Arab women, etc. Can you speak to that and what the experience has been?
I think I just need to say this to create the context for it. It's not that there has been a male dominance and women were subjugated and now the scale is swinging to the opposite. It's not that. Jesus carried the heart of the Father. And in the Father's heart, it's just his family. There are sons and daughters. So when the prophet Joel says, "I will pour out my spirit on your sons and your daughters, your men servants and your maidservants," he's laying the template for what Jesus would begin to live. And we're seeing now that in certain cultures, like for example the Arab culture, it is the first time ever that they are beginning to feel they have a voice. We have just completed last week, we've just completed an Arab Women's Conference, which was the 5th of its kind. And without going into too much detail, because it was very emotional and very sensitive, some of the things that happened there. But at this conference, we felt that we had to give men an opportunity to, or at least one man, an opportunity to speak on behalf of men. It's normally just women that lead women and teach women how the Holy Spirit flows and give them opportunity to get healed. So we had a gentleman, a fairly elderly gentleman, that spoke, and he just apologized. He just said the wrongs done to women are ancient, and some of these cultures, without singling out, some of the pagan religious cultures, they view a woman as less valuable. So when a baby girl is born, they don't celebrate her, but in some cultures they actually try to get rid of her. So in the Arab culture, it's often just the case that in the family she is seen as the person that's supposed to be in the kitchen, be the servant, eat after the men, and then when it comes to church, she definitely does not have a voice. So this gentleman was a pastor. He was just apologizing from his heart and repenting and saying, we realize that the way that we viewed you has done damage to the value that the Father created in you. And we want to say we're sorry for that. And also he spoke about the sexual approach sometimes towards women, in which even though they might not be physically taken advantage of, there's a whole viewing. He just apologized, and when he did that, there was a very, very overwhelming response. There were many of the women that were brought to tears, and the next day we had to do deep, deep ministry, healing and deliverance, because of the things that rose to the surface when he spoke. So we're seeing beautiful things happening in this land.
That's wonderful. There's a lot of significance, just from talking to other people, about this archaeological dig, this stone, etc. Some people have, ascribed great importance to it. Do you see it that way also?
Yes, definitely. Often when I guide groups here, I say that the stone is like the diamond in the ring. The setting has filigree and gold and beauty. The whole city that was discovered here is so precious. It's such a treasure that God has given us after 2,000 years. I mean, how do you hide a city of this size for so long? It's really a remarkable discovery, but the stone is something, like the Jewish people would say, mashu, something very special. Why? Well, number one, it is a representation, an artwork that speaks of the temple, and that actually portrays a person that was an eyewitness. Like if you look on the Arc of the Triumph in the Titus Ark in Rome, you would see that the menorah there has a stepped structure as its foot. Over here it has a tripod, it has 3 legs, and you must believe that it's a person that was an eyewitness that actually saw it. But for me personally, the backside of the stone, or the Holy of Holies, is the most beautiful and the most valuable. And the reason I see it that way is the Chariot of Fire opens up a whole different theme. We know that the glory of God departed from the threshold of the temple, first from the Holy of Holies, and then in the book of Ezekiel it says eventually it leaves the temple itself, and then it leaves the east gate of the country. But then there's a place in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 30 8 and 39, where it says the glory returns. So what is this glory? What is it about? In the physical representation, it was a chariot that had 4 living creatures with 4 different faces, and it had wheels within wheels, and fire and lightning all over the place. But what it essentially communicates is that when somebody is in trouble, God comes and he rides the clouds very swiftly. Makes me think of Jonathan Helser, who says, "My Father can fly faster than I can fall."
Yeah.
So I think for Israel, per se, it's a beautiful encouragement to just say, God is still on the throne, and when we cry, he is super fast. And, here in Israel, just beyond the Golan border, we have some real dangers. So it's good news to know that he is there and that he responds when we're in trouble. But it's a message of encouragement to everybody. Like the lion face says, when you're in danger, I'll eat up your enemies. And the ox says, I'll be a servant to you and the burden that you bear. And the eagle says, I'll lift you out of your circumstances and give you perspective and let you see what I see. And the man says, I have compassion because I really understand. And these 4 sentries, when we look at them in archaeology, like we found, archaeologists have discovered 10 of these living creatures or cherubim throughout the world. But if I personally stand next to the ones in the British Museum, I don't even reach its knee. So they were always pictures of strength and intelligence and speed, and they were mainly found at the gates of cities and at a king's throne, next to a king's throne. But what they say in this context, as we look at it in our study of the stone, is they just say these are attributes of the Father himself, that he cares, that he hears, and that he is a savior at his essence.
In the stone, you refer to it as a representation of the temple. You're talking about the temple in Jerusalem. This was the second temple, I guess.
That's right.
And and is this considered one of the more accurate artifacts, saying depicting the temple? Are there any other artifacts that show like a model of it?
There are not. This is the only one that they have found. It's the only 3D model that they have found.
And that's important. It's not just a matter that it was some kind of a flat picture or drawing, but it's literally a 3D model of the temple at the time that it existed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. And it had a very interesting shape. It kind of slants so that you wonder, is it a footstool? And it had these outcroppings on the corners that you're thinking, okay, was there a wooden lectern put on top of it? Was it a Torah reading stone, or was it just liturgical furniture? What is this exactly? But what is interesting to me is at that stage, with the Second Temple period, the real Ark of the Covenant wasn't in it anymore. Remember that was removed at the time of the Babylonian exile.
Right.
So the interpretation that we have of the chariot of fire are spiritual thinkers. It's people who have a high value for God and for the temple and the Holy of Holies, and they're connecting a number of scriptures in the Bible in order to come to this representation. But for them to say, yes, we know we go to the temple 3 times a year, but we want that temple to be in our midst.
Right.
It says something of the Jewish heart and an appreciation towards the temple and its value for it.
And you talk about the Holy of Holies, so that was like the most inner sanctum in the temple.
That's right.
And I think was it only the highest rabbi that could enter once a year, I think.
The
right?
high priest.
The high priest, rather,
That's right.
could enter once a year, and that was it.
That's right. That's right.
So and it was sort of this fabled thing, but to say that, wow, there's actually a 3D model of it.
Yeah.
That comes from then. Did we learn anything that we didn't otherwise know about it?
The top surface fascinates me. This big rosette is still a question. Rina Talgram from Hebrew University was the professor tasked with researching this stone, and she's been doing that for the past 5+ years. And what we thought is going to be an archaeological article is now a book. And they're asking, so what is this rosette? Is it like a embroidery on the veil.
Yeah, sort of looks like a flower.
That's
Yeah,
right,
Yeah.
a six-petaled flower.
Yeah.
If I'm allowed to give my opinion,
Yes.
I think it has a different meaning. In archaeology, I've noticed that this specific symbol is found very much on ossuaries.
Mm-hmm.
So from that period, you find that when, first of all, I have to say that the approach towards burial and resurrection has changed by the time of Jesus. In the time of King David, or even earlier with Abraham, the scripture would say he died and he was gathered to his fathers, which just means his bones were thrown into a common repository, and that's how he was gathered. But by the time of Jesus, there's a distinct belief in resurrection. And by now, they put the person not on a flat slab to have his bones decompose and then gather the bones, get the corpse to decompose. They put the person into a cork, which is 1/2 meter high, 1/2 meter wide, and they put the embalmed body into the shaft, and then they close it with a galgal, a stone that fits into it. And then after a year, they take the bones out and they put that in an ossuary. An ossuary was as wide as your skull and as long as your femur. And on most of these ossuaries from the Second Temple period, we find a rosette. So if we look at gravestones and why and how we engrave our tombstones today, you would immediately think, well, why this specific symbol repeats?
Right.
Here it has 6 petals, the next ossuary it has 8 petals, or 10, or 12, or a myriad of petals. Why always this flower? And then I'm beginning to say, well, maybe it was a symbol of the hope of afterlife. And now suddenly, not on an ossuary, but you find it on this stone that represents the temple. So what if the artist was saying, okay, the greatest hope of afterlife is God himself. You know, like you said, the high priest had a brush with death when he would go in there, especially if he was irreverent.
Right.
So, in my opinion, I think that rosette has something to do with the very theme of Magdala, which is the message that Mary Magdalene came away with, which is, he is risen.
Wow. So when you said you had a desire, I guess earlier, to say that you're hoping you could get in on a dig, did you ever expect it to be something of this significance?
No. What I didn't expect is that it would attract so much interest. Busloads full of internationals come and see this site. It's become one of the must-sees in the land and in the Galilee. But a large percentage of Jewish people come here, and they not only see the archaeology, they see the synagogue, they see the mikvaot, and then they ask, what is this building? And they come down here. And when we see them again, they're not coming with a group, they're coming with their families, and they run down to this place first.
Right.
And they say, this is such a nice place, I like the artwork, and the feeling is so good.
Yeah.
And all of this is surprising to us. It
Yeah.
adds to the treasure that we've discovered.
What's it like when you get down into the actual dig and you're uncovering things, you know, through that process? What's the experience like for you?
It's very, very hard work.
Yes.
We dig in the summer, which means it's very high temperatures.
Yeah.
And we rise at about 4 or 5 in the morning. We have our breakfast, our first bowl of cereal at that stage. And then by 11 o'clock, you're ravenous, you're hungry again. So you work really, really hard. But every person that comes has this expectation, to a greater or a lesser amount, that they will find something. So it's like a glorified treasure hunt, you know. You hope to find a coin, you hope to find even a horse's tooth or a piece of glass or something. And it's amazing if you find something in stone. Like I once found half a grinding stone. But when we discovered specifically the big stone, the one that's representative of the temple, it was something else. Actually, Dina Gorani, who was the archaeologist that oversaw this dig right in the beginning, she said when they began to excavate the wall of the synagogue, she was in shock. For 3 days, she didn't tell anybody that she actually thought this was a synagogue. Because, you know, archaeology is a science. So if you make a foolish exclamation right in the beginning, yeah, you get forgiven, but you know,
Hurt
later
your
on.
reputation, yeah.
It's your reputation maybe to the wind. But she just, she was so excited that this place was found. And of course the mikvaot, the purification pools, when we discovered that the water started coming up after 2,000 years, we had to have it connected to a pump and get the water pumped out so that we could excavate that place.
Wow.
But it's a great adventure. You know, something radically changed in me. In the beginning I thought, well, long before I studied, I thought, what makes somebody want to get into a hole and not get out of it?
In great heat.
You know? Yes. But now, with archaeology, you get in there and you just want to go to the lowest level.
Right.
What is special about Magdala is that because it's a first century dig, it means it is the lowest level for us at least. We haven't found any lower levels, and it's a single period find, which is an archaeologist's dream.
Wow.
Because, you know, take Megiddo, if you cut a shaft through that city, you find 21 or 25 layers of civilization, and at the top you find a stone that was used in the Chalcolithic period, you know?
Right.
So it's a great joy when you discover things that have not been dismantled in order to build something else, and it's just almost in situ as is.
And this is what's, I guess, really remarkable. It is a find from the time of Jesus, in the place where Jesus lived and spent, you know, much of his time.
Yeah.
And so many, you know, of the stories and the history of Jesus comes right from this area.
Yeah.
And there it is, all in place, sitting there in the ground, just being uncovered. So that had to be, you know, quite an extraordinary experience. How has it impacted your faith, if at all?
Wow. I think if I look at the word Migdal, which means tower, and its root is Gadol, which means big, and Ligdol, that means grow. I think in Mary Magdalene, I saw a woman that within the short span of her engagement with Jesus grew to a point of maturity that I would like to be. Yeah. Somewhere in those 3 years, whether it was at the beginning of his life or whether it was in the last year of his ministry, she was set free from 7 demons. And when we engage her at the point where Jesus entrusts the good news to her to go tell his brothers, we see that she has walked to a place of faithfulness where she didn't run away at the crucifixion. She was the first one there at the morning of the tomb after the Sabbath. And how did she come to a place of such rapid growth? And for me, it's become an inspiration that in the shortest possible time, she has loved Jesus so much, and she has probably walked in a road of obedience to such an extent that he entrusted her, and it has surely become an inspiration for me. And just what Jesus carried in terms of his love for the Father and who he was as a man. You know, that painting down in the Encounter Chapel, which shows his feet as really big. Yeah. Sometimes I sit there and I think about him, and I think how big he is and how he became small. He became small enough to fit in a woman's womb. But he is so huge in what he has accomplished and what his heart is and the honor the Father bestowed upon him. So I think I've come to know him a little bit more, and the desire is growing as I have the privilege to be in this place.
Well, we have had the privilege of being with you, and I very much appreciate you sharing your inspiration with us. And it's been really a wonderful experience to learn about the work you're doing and what this place is meaning to the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was amazing. I am just blown away by all that we've been able to show you, and I've been a part of it too. But coming up tomorrow on episode 8, we have an interview with Dr. Gabriel Bar-Kai, and he will be taking us through a wonderful journey through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And we also have another interview with Kim Dortilli.
Yeah, so very special day tomorrow. For me, I know what's coming, and it makes me kind of well up with a lot of joy, because there's some really special elements that we're going to be bringing to the table. Starting with Dr. Gabriel Bar-Kai, or we call him Gabby, was how we referred to him when we were talking to him. This is a man who's got a very distinguished pedigree, if you will, a background that is somewhat unmatched in Israel for some of the discoveries I had made, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But he's just such an intelligent man with a great wit. And we start out with an interview on our rooftop in Jerusalem. It's an outdoor interview, amazing conversation. Then we walk right up the street and we go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I have to tell you that when you walk in there, you know you are in a very holy place. So that particular tour in that church is extraordinary. I can't wait to walk you through that. You're going to be very moved by it. And then we have our interview with Kim Doherty. Kim is an associate pastor at the Bel Air Church, and I have to tell you, when your mission is to save some souls in Hollywood, you got a pretty big mission. And to hear her talk about her years there working in Hollywood and the type of work that she's been doing in her experience, it can't help but bring inspiration. And I can remember tearing up in that interview more than a couple of times. So get ready for some big inspiration when you listen to Kim Doherty. It also feels a little bit bittersweet to me right now. We're just concluding episode 7 of our 9-part series. So this has been an amazing journey, and I have to tell you there's a crescendo that we're building to. For example, in episode 9, we have my interview with Governor Mike Huckabee, and you just want to tune in for that. I also need to remind you that while the episodes are running right now as we're coming to the end, that you can own Christ Revealed for 50% off the normal price. I think you can see now how important this content is, how inspiring it is, how it can change lives. So for yourself, and maybe even for some people that you really care about, it's a great time to invest in Christ Revealed. Check out the packages we have. Make the right decision for you. We certainly appreciate the support. I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.